springs to mind. Like maybe like no, that's not. No, I was gonna say like Bobby Briggs in Twin Peaks, but his was long on top, but his was short on the side, so that doesn't really work either, so.
Before we go too deep into hairstyles, I'd like to welcome everybody back to another episode of Tell Me Where I'm Going Wrong, a podcast where two exes who are still really good friends talk about everything: life, politics, hairstyles, Lady Gaga, food, you name it, we talk about it. I'm Sean and that's Josh. Hi Josh, how are you?
Hi Sean, I'm okay, thank you, apart from my existential crisis surrounding my current hair situation, but I'm fine. We talk about dystopian, like post-apocalyptic dystopia as well, don't we? Quite regularly.
Yeah.
This plant's really annoying me as well. It keeps hitting me on the top of the head.
So your hair, we're talking about your hair when people joined us. We're in the middle of a conversation about your hair. What's the longest you've ever had your hair?
I think when I was a teenager, so before I knew you, I think I had it about sort of just above shoulder length. And I would sometimes wear it like back in like a headband and stuff like that, like an Alice band sort of thing. Why is it called an Alice band, by the way?
I don't know. Live
What's
research.
the etymology? Like, yeah, get on the live research.
I'm doing it.
Yeah.
So that's the longest.
What about you? You before I knew you, I think you had really long hair as well, didn't you? You had like a perm situation, didn't you?
I had all sorts of hairstyles. I did grow my hair, about to a similar length. I've had it that length maybe a couple of times in my life, mostly when I was younger. And then when I was a teenager, when I was 15, I had, my hair was about that long to my chin. And I shaved all of this to right down to blade one. And this side here, I dyed red and got it permed. So I had like a big perm on this side, but it was sort of like bright red and shaved. There.
You've got a photo of that somewhere, haven't you? I've seen a photo of that.
But growing up in Brisbane, and well, actually in a town called Redcliffe, which is north of Brisbane, I really stood out. Like it was a very conservative, and still probably is a very conservative place, very straight-laced, not very exciting, not a lot of culture, not much diversity. And to be like a 15-year-old queer kid with that sort of hairstyle, wearing outrageous clothes for the time and the location, that was considered outrageous.
Your hairstyle was effectively illegal, wasn't it? I mean, homosexuality was illegal in Queensland.
My hairstyle wasn't the one having anal intercourse. It was.
Was it on the verge of being obscene, though?
Yeah, I was fanning the flames of its faggotry, but it was. That's a Margaret Cho reference for anyone who doesn't know. But it was, I would go to work because I left school and I moved out of home when I was 15, and I was having this outrageous hairstyle. I was going out clubbing. It was illegal to be gay. It was wild times. And I would go to work in this shoe shop where I worked, and I had this it was like a white button-up shirt, similar style to what I'm wearing, but it was a heavy linen, and it was white or an off-white, but it had big red roses on it, and it was beautiful. It was a beautiful blouse, if you will. And
sounds very Robert Smith.
I turned up at work at this shoe shop, 15 years old, in this blouse with this hairdo, like this red perm shaved on the side. It was really quite outrageous. Like if I saw a kid now walking around like that, it would get my attention. Like I wouldn't think anything negative of them, it would just get my attention. And to think that I was doing that in the 90s, very early 90s, in a hyper-conservative place like Redcliffe, it was wild that I wasn't beaten to death on the streets because that's, it was quite a violent place. And quite...
I mean, you were verbally harassed, weren't you?
Yeah, and we were sometimes chased by people. Like, people tried to beat us up. I mean, I don't mean to sound dismissive about it, but just, I suppose you normalize it when you grow up like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, just dressing like that and having those sorts of, like, we used to go out to clubs when I was 15 and 16 in Fortitude Valley, which was the entertainment sort of red light district of Brisbane. And we would
Mm,
have to catch public transport to go there. So we would
mm,
come from Redcliffe, which was up to an hour public transport journey away or half an hour driving. And we would go on public transport and dressed in outrageous clothes with outrageous uh, hairstyles, without the outrageous fortune because we were so poor. But we would travel and yeah, get into like slanging matches, verbal slanging matches on the train with people who would be calling us, F slurs and you name it. And
mm.
I don't know, we just kind of felt that it was par for the course in a way. Like
Yeah.
it didn't strike me as unusual. I didn't like it, obviously, but it just felt, yeah, this is the what
That was
happens to
that was the
people like us.
landscape. Yeah, that was the landscape where you that you knew that you grew up in. So it was just normalized, I suppose.
And even in queer clubs and underground alternative clubs, we would get harassed, or some of us would get harassed and abused by other queer people who were more normal presenting,
Mm,
and like I used to wear makeup and have these hairstyles and like chiffon blouses and like tartan trousers with elastic in the side and all these sorts of wild costumes, like outfits and makeup that I didn't know how to put on. It wasn't like today where you could have a YouTube video where you could, watch Trixie Mattel telling you how to put makeup on. I would just randomly put bits of makeup on my face that made no sense and uh, they were not well applied. There was no strategy to it.
it's very punk, very punk.
Yeah, it was very punk. It was queer and punk. And so, yeah, my hair used to be very much an extension of that. Like it would be uh, like it would be the hairstyle represent visual version of like a pink chiffon blouse. But
Okay.
I I have very normal haircuts these days. I don't. Why do we change so much? Why do we become so
Well, I think,
willing to
when you're
toe the line?
young, you really define yourself a lot by your hair and by your fashion, by your appearance. And I think as you get older, you just don't. I mean, not everyone. This is generalizing, of course, but I think we generally just sort of mellow down and not care so much about what message we're putting out to the world or what part of our identity we want to communicate to the world. But listen, I want to change from last century in Queensland, Australia, to last night in Spitalfields because I had FOMO when I saw your pictures of the is it macamo Ethiopian food that you had
Camo,
last night?
yeah.
Macamo, yeah. So tell me about that because it looked delicious.
Well, do you know? Have you been into Spitalfields Market recently?
No, you asked me
When
that
was
a few episodes ago on the pod, and
Yeah? When
no,
was the last time you were in there?
like about 3 years ago or more,
Okay.
maybe.
Well, you might remember this then. There is a food stall inside Spitalfields Market called
Hmm.
Makama, and it's a
Yeah.
vegan Ethiopian food stall.
Well, they've
And it,
traded at some of our markets in the past as well. Like, so for those watching or
are
listening who
you
haven't,
are you sure? I think you're thinking of somebody else.
no, I'm sure they have. I'm sure they have. I'm sure they traded at Venn Street Market. Um,
Well, she was saying that she'd never heard of me or met me last night. The
I'm
owner.
sure it was. I'm sure we met her at her stall in Spitalfields Market, like I don't know,
I think
seven,
you're
eight
thinking of
years ago.
Helen Red Tent Ethiopian. She's the one
But
who's
I,
traded at our market.
but did we meet her in Spitalfields?
I can't remember, but
Uh,
Helen at
anyway,
Red Tent, she traded at Venn Street multiple times
okay,
for us. Like
okay.
yeah, and then she also was at Vegan Life Live last year, and I chatted with her a lot. I helped her with setting up her payment terminal because she didn't know what was going on; it wouldn't keep working. So I helped her
Mm-hmm.
connect to the hotspot. Um, But
But
yeah,
sorry,
that's
just
who I think
let
you're
me just
thinking of.
contextualize something. So for those, like I was saying, for those watching or listening, um, Sean and I used to run a lot of vegan events and markets in London. So we had a long running Hackney Downs vegan market. And then we also had a hand in running a vegan section at Ben Street Market in Clapham and a very short lived vegan section at Walthamstow Market as well. But
Oh
um,
yeah, that was like
that's
2 weeks or something.
yeah, it didn't last too long. But yeah, that's what we're referring to. And also, sorry to jump around in time and space, but I also want to say a big welcome to all of our listeners who are now listening on Apple Podcasts.
Oh
So
right.
after nearly a year of doing the podcast, we finally figured out, or when I say we finally, somebody actually told us that it's really easy to get your podcast hosted on Apple Podcasts. And from the moment we started the pod, I was saying to Sean, I think we need to be on Apple Podcasts because I think that's where most people listen to pods.
Mm-mm.
And we both looked and we couldn't figure it out without having, without paying, like without paying for somebody to host an RSS feed. Anyway, it's very boring, technical. Anyway, we went to a sort of a podcast networking event a couple of weeks ago, or last week actually. And we met a guy who was like, no, you just literally flick a switch on Spotify and it pops up on your Apple Podcast. And so, like, we were just like, oh God, we're such dunces. We have no clue what we're
I
doing.
mean, we're really not in the realm of being professional podcasters and broadcasters, are we?
Which I think people have already, if they haven't already watched our podcast before, they've already established, 10 minutes in,
Yeah.
that's the case. But
But anyway, I'd
so anyway, sorry.
give a shout out to Alex who
Yes,
helped us.
thank you, Alex.
Alex Moore, Moore. If anyone wants to follow Alex, he's a podcaster and a producer, podcast producer. He's based in Portland, and you can follow him on Instagram. It's More of Alex, Moore of Alex, and he's got a podcast, and he's involved in a few different podcasts. So shout out to Alex. I did promise him in the heat of the moment, if the advice he gave us worked and we got on that, I would send him some vegan donuts from Voodoo Donuts in
Yes, that's
Portland.
right.
And so it worked, and now I owe him donuts. And I don't know how to
Okay.
go about getting them to him. But anyway, I could send him a voucher, right?
So anyway, tell me about this Ethiopian meal.
Okay, so I don't think we've ever traded with
Okay, well, it doesn't
Zina.
matter to our listeners or viewers, I don't think. But yeah,
Zinash is the founder and owner.
mm-hmm.
And Zinash has been trading inside Spitalfields for about 9 years. And her stall is kind of like a permanent unit now, but it's still a stall. And she's there all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And she now also has a permanent restaurant just a few blocks away on Hanbury Street. And it is, I think it's been open for about eight and a half months, she said, when I was chatting with her last night. So it's 100% vegan.
Mm-hmm.
The food is unbelievably good. Like, it's sensational. Now, she invited me for free in my capacity as Fat Gay Vegan to come and review it. So I didn't pay for anything, but the prices didn't seem too extraordinarily outrageous for London. It seemed like normal London prices, but
Mm-hmm.
the food was some of the best I've ever had in London. It was
Oh
incredible, but she
wow.
brought so much to the table. Often when I get invited to review or, showcase a restaurant, they want me to see the best of what they've got, obviously, but they want the table to look really super full in any content that I make. So the food was way too much. But there were lentil stews, there were vegetables, injera. There was these dumplings with spicy sauces and other lentil stews, the mango drinks, cake, so much food, and
Wow.
everything was incredible. Like, I couldn't fault anything. It was some of the best food I've tasted in a long time. Also, the restaurant is gorgeous. It is just a few steps off Brick Lane,
Mm-hmm.
and the they have a beautiful upstairs dining room, but also downstairs they've got another beautiful dining room. So it's really good for like if you want to have a party there or a celebration or work meal. You could probably rent it out for weddings or parties, anything. Do you know there's an Australian band called Weddings, Parties, Anything?
Hmm.
Um, so I can't recommend it enough. If you're interested
Okay.
in food of any sort, this is like a real foodie paradise. And I talked to Zinash, the owner and founder, for a long time last night. She loves to chat, and so do I. So we were like chatting, and she was telling me about her own background and her connection to food and why she does what she does, and how she was born in Ethiopia, and how she started her own business, and the putting the money into the restaurant and the risk, but she believes so much in her food that it doesn't feel like such a risk. And yeah, it was wonderful. And there were a lot of people in there last night. I think it's a very popular destination because the food is so spectacular. The reputation, it just spreads around London.
Hmm. Do you remember? I couldn't say how long ago it was. It must be nearly 20 years ago. Do you remember we were in LA, in California, and we went to a vegan restaurant, and I can't remember what it was called, but I remember it was a really beautiful building. It was like on a corner, and it was sort of like a bar style,
Yeah,
with a curved staircase and like an upstairs eating gallery. And do you remember we were talking to the server there. I mean, this would have been no, maybe early noughties. And we were talking to the server there, and she was saying, "Oh, have you guys ever tried Ethiopian food?" And we were like, "No." And she said, "Oh, you should check out this place on Fairfax called Rahel's Vegan Ethiopian or Vegetarian
yeah,
Ethiopian or something." And she was talking to us about how a lot of Ethiopian food is by default vegan because they have in their version of Christianity. I don't know what the actual official name is, but in Ethiopian Christian communities, they have a lot of days of the year when they fast, and by fast they mean they don't have any animal products, and so a lot of Ethiopian food has sort of developed to be completely plant-based by
yeah,
default. And we were completely like ignorant and had no idea about this. And I
yeah.
remember
Well,
we did go to Rahel's Ethiopian on Fairfax, and it was
mhm.
delicious.
So
Um,
Zenash last night was talking to me about that, about
oh yeah.
how it's like a Christian Orthodox religious observance that
Hmm.
has popularized the
Mm.
plant-based versions of the food,
Mm.
and then a lot of people should take that further and just do it all the time.
Mm.
Um, but she said also there was her understanding of it, having lived the experience, was that
Mm.
a lot of the vegan plant-based options also came out of the need to eat more frugally because people couldn't afford meat. Meat was very expensive.
Right.
And so there
Right.
was like the Christian Orthodox influence plus also the socioeconomic reality for a lot of people. And so that came together to marry into having such a prevalence of plant-based food.
I find it quite interesting that this notion of fasting being giving up animal products, because you find a similar thing in Greek Orthodox religion as well, don't you? That in Greek Orthodox religion, when people fast, they don't consume any dairy, and that's how Violife, who is one of the biggest manufacturers globally, I think, of vegan cheese,
Yeah.
was made. I don't know if it's still owned by them, but it was, originally made by a Greek dairy company who wanted to come up with a formula that people could still eat cheese in inverted commas while they were fasting.
Yeah.
And I find that really interesting that this idea of fasting is a I suppose the underlying ideology around that is that you're making a sacrifice, you're giving something up, giving up a luxury maybe.
But other
Um,
other religions do that. I mean, Catholics do that. They give up certain things, don't they?
well, milk and eggs, right? Isn't that why Shrove Tuesday is before Lent? Is that I don't know. I
But
mean, my
also, don't
religious
people
education
don't?
is.
Yeah, I'm not religious or religious understandable. Familiar with religious practices at all, really. But don't
Hmm.
Catholics give up things for Lent? Like they say, oh,
Yeah,
"What are you
yeah.
giving up for Lent?" But is it like optional what you give up, or do you just?
I think so, but then I think the whole pancake thing came about because I think you were supposed to give up milk and eggs, and I find that very. I don't know. I'd love to read a bit more about that. About why animal products are considered a luxury and why giving them up is a sign of reverence, I suppose, or
And then in
respect.
the Jewish religion, I mean, there's all sorts of rules and restrictions around what you can eat and when you can eat it, right?
Yeah, but that's less to do with giving something up, even temporarily. It's about, I think, about sort of which foods can be eaten together. And again, I'm so ignorant about it that maybe we shouldn't, because we don't want to invite any more hate comments on TikTok. But I think it's a different mentality in Judaism. It's not so much about giving stuff up. It's about not having certain foods at all, and then not having certain foods with other ones because they're considered dirty or um, whatever the term is, which I can't remember off the top of my head. But yeah,
Non kosher, no par non par or something. Or
yeah. But there's an actual word that escapes me. But anyway, but yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? That that seems quite prevalent among several versions of Christianity, at least.
and I mean, obviously, like people fast in Jewish religion, like is it Yom Kippur or like
Yeah,
there's
I
like a
don't
20
know.
like I'm just
Yeah,
looking here. It's like a 25-hour fast where you refrain from eating, drinking, and engaging in certain activities. Um, but
and
yeah,
fasting is common in other, like Hinduism and stuff like that. Fasting
yeah.
is common. Yeah,
But I
but
mean, I think there are quite a lot of minor fasts through the year with uh, for Jewish religion and observant Jews. And
yeah.
anyway, so people should go to this restaurant. It's delicious. You can either go to their Spitalfields stall, or you can
Mm,
go and have sit in a sort of proper restaurant. I really recommend it. But I started to look about like I was talking to Hill last night about how fascinating London is. That
mm,
every corner you turn around, there is something or some little piece of hidden history. And
mm,
on Hanbury Street, where Macamo is, it's just off Brick Lane. It like intersects with Brick Lane. And I
mm,
was reading about this street, and there is so much history packed on this one tiny couple of block street. It
mm,
opposite where the restaurant is, there's I think it's number 29 Hanbury Street, is
mm,
the site of where they believe well, there's a body found there, murdered, and they believe it was the second victim of Jack the Ripper.
mm,
And it's one of the most famous sites because they know that it is actually where a woman's body was found.
mm,
And so, a lot of the walking tours, Jack the Ripper walking tours, go there because it is a known site and they've attributed that murder to Jack the Ripper.
mm.
There was also a house along there where somebody set up a sort of a charity or a social, not justice, like a social well-being house for women who are either working in sex work, prostitution, or at risk of being vulnerable to having to do that to survive. And there was a house there that was set up almost like a charity to help women in that situation, going back a very long time, because that part of the East End was very. There was a lot of sex work prevalent in that part of the city. But then
Mm.
also something I didn't know, a bit of queer history that I didn't know. Do you know there was that guy who nail bombed the Admiral Duncan
Mhm.
pub? Did you know that he set off other devices around London before he was caught?
Yeah,
I didn't know
yeah,
that, and I
yeah.
read that he he planned because part of his whole shtick was that he was like a white supremacist and he wanted to start sort of a war between the black communities of um, London and the
Mhm,
queer community. That was part of his weird manifesto between,
mm,
people of color and queer people. And so that was one of the reasons he bombed the Admiral Duncan gay pub in Soho. And he
mm.
left a note trying to blame it on black people from Brixton, I think, as doing
Oh,
it.
right, okay.
And
Yeah.
then one of his other devices, what's that word? Is it incendiary?
Incendiary.
incendiary devices that he left, he was planning on bombing Brick Lane, and
Right. Okay.
he went down there, and there weren't as many people as he thought there would be, because he went on a day
Mm.
when it wasn't busy. So he just left the bag on Hanbury Street, the street where the Ethiopian restaurant is, and
Mm.
somebody found the bag with the device in it, and they put it in their car, and they went to drive it to the local police station, and the police station was closed. So they started driving back, and then they panicked and thought, oh, what if it's a bomb that's going to explode that I found? So they just stopped their car in the middle of the street and they ran away.
Mm.
And it was right near Hanbury Street or Fashion Street, right on Brick Lane, and the car exploded and injured 6 people,
Mm.
and I
Wow.
think damaged a couple of cars. But so Hanbury Street is such a rich history in itself, and it's just this one tiny little street. You think of all the streets in
Yeah.
London with all of
Well,
these fascinating stories.
that whole area around Brick Lane is so interesting. Like you've got all these different waves of migration.
Mhm.
Like you had the French Huguenots were there. Then you had like it was a very Jewish neighborhood for a long time. Now it's very South Asian, predominantly. Um, well, no, it's not Indian actually, is it? Is it more Pakistani?
Well, there's a lot of Indian restaurants. I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know if a lot of the restaurants are. I don't know. I don't know how it works. Like if people are from different cultural and cuisine areas of Asia, but it's easier for them to market their food as Indian. I think sometimes that might happen, but most of the
Okay.
restaurants are Indian, right? So
Yeah.
as are
Yeah.
presented as Indian, but yeah, it's like a very long street with I don't know how many, what, 100
Oh,
Indian restaurants?
yeah.
Do you think?
Yeah, but it's all the side streets as well, isn't it?
Yeah,
Often all the side streets there are restaurants.
but that area, though, I don't know. There's still some remnants of the old textile industries that used to be there. So you look above some of the shops, and there are like material warehouses, fabric
Mm.
warehouses, and the names of some of the streets like Fashion Street,
Hmm.
and yeah, it's a very very fascinating part of the city,
Well,
which is
yeah,
being which is
I need to get over there.
but it's weird, right? Like it's being rapidly gentrified. I mean, I don't even know if that's the right term, but people are being priced out of, like any part of London. Like business rates and rental rates for businesses are through the roof. Like it's
Mm.
unsustainable. So you've got
Mm.
that, but you've still got an incredibly working class and poor class of people living in a lot of social housing around there. There were a lot of old buildings that were like tenements. Like you were talking about the Jewish community that lived there. It was often referred to as a slum
Hmm.
and tenements. And so the buildings, they're a mixture of like really old and not big enough or fit for purpose for people to live in, but that are now incredibly expensive to buy and live in or to work in.
But I
It's
used
such
to have to
weird.
go on like I don't really endorse it. I think it's a glamorization of violence, particularly towards women. But I used to have to go on Jack the Ripper walking tours when I was working with American universities. I would have to go, and I think you came on one once, and maybe Julio and Carlos maybe came along on one. Anyway, but the thing I remember most about those Jack the Ripper tours was their description of life in that area during that period. And I mean, it just sounded horrific. I mean, when you talk about tenements, there were places, and I can't remember what they were called, but there were so many people who couldn't afford to have a bed that there would be whole rooms where they would just have a rope going across the room from one wall to the other wall, and people would have to pay like a small amount to lean against the rope and spend the night leaning against a rope. Which
Like
today
like
just
sitting up, right? So they would often like get behind the rope and hook their arms over it, and they'd just
yeah,
slump over the rope.
yeah,
Yeah,
to try and get like a few hours of like snatched sleep here and there, like
yeah.
leaning up against
Being
a
a
rope.
poor person in London in 2025 is a very different experience, and it's not to negate what people
Yeah.
go through, but it's a very and there are unhoused and homeless people in London. Like it's not. We're not saying that that doesn't exist, but the poor class in like around those times, like Victorian times, and it was it was absolutely wild to think how people lived in
Mm.
London, in the slums of
Yeah.
London.
Yeah. And that was just one tiny part. That was just how you might spend the evenings. Um, but like, yeah, just the advancements that we've made in so many ways, and yet people are still, we're still all fucking miserable, aren't we? Um, Despite all these luxuries that we have around us compared to, not that long ago in human history,
It's
we're still.
funny, like well, talking about like how how our perception of things change about like
Hmm,
what is a good quality of life,
hmm,
or like if you were 200 years ago or 300 years ago living in London and you had
hmm,
no money,
hmm.
what was your how old would you live to be? Maybe what was the average
Oh,
lifespan of a
I
poor
I don't
person?
know, but off the top of my head, I would say it was probably like late 30s, 40s, maybe.
And then things like fleas and like diseases like that swept through, like the
Oh
plague,
yeah,
and
yeah. I
uh,
mean, you wouldn't have, you'd probably have all your teeth out, because dentistry wasn't a thing anyone could really afford except the very, very rich. Um,
and
yeah,
even then
just
it
it.
probably wasn't advanced enough to even
Oh
save
no,
rich
I mean
people's
they
teeth.
may not have even had proper anesthesia or anything like that. But you know what? I sent that podcast to you the other day that I've been listening to,
Hmm.
and I was listening to that and thinking about. There's a section in that which I don't know if have you
Do you wanna
listened to all of it?
say the name of it for so people have a
I
context of
would,
what?
but I've forgotten the name. Is it called The Fall of Civilizations? Is that what it's
I think so.
called?
Let me have a look at
I think
my.
it's called The Fall of Civilizations
Well, I'm
podcast.
currently listening to it, but the episode you sent me
Hmm.
is 4 hours long. So
Hmm.
I'm only
Yeah.
about 40 minutes into, but in that first 40 minutes, my mind has been blown about 1,000 times from the facts that
Yeah, yeah. It's very, very
it's
well
called
presented.
Fall of Civilizations podcast.
Hmm.
And the episode I'm listening to is number 9, The Aztecs, A Clash of Worlds.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. It's very, very well presented. But there's a section in that which you probably haven't gotten to yet, where he's talking about Hernan Cortez, who was a Spanish man who is credited, or credited is perhaps the right word. He's named in history as being very instrumental in the Spanish conquest of Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And just talking about how many times he came so close to being killed, and just thinking about how we live such, I mean, not we as in everyone on the planet, but like you and I, we live relatively such incredibly privileged, comfortable lives compared
Yeah.
to people. And not to, I don't mean to glorify Hernan Cortez either, because he did some horrific things. Um, but just in terms of our day-to-day existence, like, people in centuries gone by would live like literally hour to hour, not knowing whether
Yeah.
they would still be around. And maybe they didn't have such sort of existential ponderings as we do now, but I don't know. I can't help but think you would.
Well,
Um,
I think they did, but it was through a different scope. So a different lens, I mean. Like
hmm.
I'm reading this, the Love
Oh
in
yeah,
the
Love in the
Time of
Time of
Cholera,
Cholera. Hmm.
Gabriel Garcia Marquez. But um, the way that people lived their life through an understanding of divinity or religion or
Hmm.
spirituality. So it was very fantastical and, yeah, very, very, a lot of existential crises, but through their understanding of their right to get into heaven, or what God thought if they were doing the right thing or not. And
Hmm.
like even falling in love was, they often believed was, I mean, I know this is a story, but it's obviously a reflection of a certain
Yeah,
time.
yeah,
And even falling in love with somebody, it was either you know divinely bestowed upon you, or
yeah, yeah.
somebody writing a beautiful love letter to you was actually God speaking through them. Or
Hmm.
so I think there was a lot of that going on. And because they had a different understanding of the world back then, a different concept of the meaning of existence. They
Mm-hmm.
just used a different framework. And now, what's our framework? Science and human rights.
Well, yeah, or capitalism is our framework, I think.
Yeah,
I
we
think
all.
capitalism affects every single aspect of our lives, in ways that it hasn't necessarily in centuries gone by. Um,
I mean, there are still people who claim that they're making decisions based on their religious beliefs or what they say they're being told to do.
hmm,
Whether they really believe that themselves or not is another thing. But
hmm.
a lot of the wars are justified through that, aren't they?
Yeah, but even I was over at your place the other night, and we were talking about this, weren't we? Like I was saying, even religion now operates within a capitalist framework. Religion is so much about fundraising now, and it's all based on capital, on money, on money for whatever, money for building a new church, on money for sending missionaries around the world, or often in as is often the case, money that goes into the pockets of people. Who are saying it's all in the name of the Lord or whatever, but it's
But
actually just
that
going into their pocket.
so it's like a business.
Yeah.
But before that, it was like um, it still took money from people, but it did it without asking. So,
Oh yeah.
religion used to, like, Hernan Cortez was a conquistador, what's the English word for that?
I don't know.
Conquesta, conquest.
Something like that. Yeah.
I can't think of the.
Colonizer, I
Yeah,
suppose. But
but
yeah.
through colonization, people would
Mm,
take money, and the church would take money and take livelihood and people's bodies
mm,
and cities and physical spaces and they would control people using religion. And so
mm,
yeah, now it's more organized form of colonization now with capitalism, isn't it? There are
mm,
structures and there are social contracts that people believe they have to follow, but it's a way of
mm.
um, funneling wealth from people to other people.
Yeah. Yeah. That when I was over the other evening and we were talking about sort of a collective. No, don't know if trauma is the right word, but a collective dissociation. Post COVID, we were talking just about how we all have lived through this really strange experience of having a real existential crisis more than most people in developed nations have had to face in a lifetime. If you've grown up in the UK post World War II, you may have been disadvantaged or you may have suffered different experiences, but to collectively as a society face a threat such as COVID is something that many of us haven't had to. I mean, there are lots of people around the world, like Gaza, for example, or Ukraine, where they do have to face an existential crisis or threat to their existence every day. But for a lot of people in developed nations, it's something that we haven't had to in over a generation. So it is a really interesting time to kind of grapple with that or come to terms with that and
I
think
would say
about.
there are parts of our populations in the countries you're talking of that have had to. So you might
Hmm,
be a refugee or a migrant living in a developed country, and that you are
hmm,
faced with a very real threat to your well-being. You might be a trans person, and you are
hmm,
faced with the shifting political sands that seem to change every hour, that
hmm.
deal directly with your well-being or your protection.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
might,
yeah.
you
But
know,
I'm talking about a threat that is indiscriminate. So not one based on discrimination. So not any form of hatred towards one particular group of people, but one that threatens the entirety of your town, city, country, continent, sort of thing.
well,
That's something.
I think in my time, I'm not much older than you, like 2 years, but you remember like the threat of nuclear
Yeah,
war. That
yeah.
was probably as big an existential crisis as COVID. Like it had that
Yeah.
feeling of the whole world is going to be destroyed, and it's so random, and it could happen anytime, and we're not
Hmm.
safe. I mean, it kept kids awake at night in the 80s. You know,
Yeah.
kids
Yeah.
couldn't sleep. I
Yeah.
think I think another form of that, which seems a bit more disembodied or not really connected to us, and it's hard to think about a lot, is global warming.
Hmm.
That because it feels like so far away still, like we might already be dead anyway from natural causes before the
Mm.
real effects of it. But it is impacting people all around the world already. I mean,
Oh yeah.
low-lying
Yeah.
island nations are being swamped by rising sea. You know, there's food refugees, like famine refugees.
Yeah.
It is happening, and so we are all being affected by that, but to different degrees, and so we have
Mm.
different understandings of it. So there are things going on, and I suppose the most, if we're talking about sort of white developed nation centric ideas of thinking, the last, apart from COVID, global warming, I think the last thing that really sort of shook people to their core was probably 9/11 and the
Mm.
attacks on the
Yeah.
World Trade Center. And that
Yeah.
felt like something that was unmanageable, that was almost like movie quality of how unreal and
Hmm.
disconnected from our lives it was. And it felt so unknown because it was such an unusual attack to happen in the world.
Yeah.
But yet you
Yeah.
think like that must have been how people felt about lots of things in history, but we just think we're special, don't we? Because we've lived
Yeah.
through it.
But there's, there just seems to be, there's so much less everyday conflict in our immediate surroundings now. I mean, obviously, it would be different if you're in different parts of the world, but there is, listening to that podcast and thinking about just how people live their lives and how we live in, in some ways we live in a much calmer time, but it actually feels much less safe than ever. Um,
But
it's
also, like,
it's
what's getting me thinking a lot with that podcast that you sent, is it called The Fall of
Fall of
Civilization?
civilizations. Yeah.
Is a fall of a civilization, which I think we're probably in right now. We're in
Mm-hmm.
end times.
Mm-hmm.
There's not an end. There
No.
is a long, long series of ends.
Yeah.
That doesn't. You don't wake up one day and everything's gone. It's
No.
like, okay, well, air quality is degrading. People are drowning at sea because there's nowhere to live, or nothing to eat. These wars are killing people. Like there's land is being degraded by mining. The ozone
Degraded.
layer
Yeah.
is, it's
Yeah.
like this is happening over a long time. What event in history has ever been that sudden where a civilization just stopped in an instant? I suppose something like Hiroshima, depending on your pronunciation. Like there was, but that's not like entire society. That was a city. But
Yeah. Yeah.
like what has happened that
Yeah. I
a
don't think. I don't
society?
think we've. But I don't think. Like you're saying, I don't think that that's how civilizations do fall. And it's, what's interesting. I've listened to a lot of episodes of that podcast now, and it always seems to be the same sort of set of circumstances where it's either people are already fighting over resources, and what those resources are can change a lot depending on the period and the location, but then some external event, normally weather related, or normally not weather related, but like a natural phenomenon like a drought or a flood or an earthquake or an asteroid, something, a volcanic eruption, something will happen which just pushes people to the edge and starts the downfall of that civilization. And I feel it feels like we're in the sort of the precursor, we're in the preamble of that at the moment, and it's not going to take much now to push society beyond the already sort of stretched limits of where we are now on a day to
But
day
when you say
basis.
society, are you talking about like the UK, or do you mean all of human existence?
I mean, all of
Are we
human
are we
existence.
are we one society?
Well, we are.
Because when
We
you
don't
talk
always
about
think of ourselves like that, but we are. Yeah.
because when you talk about sort of more the ancient, not ancient world, but the older world, like, where this podcast is talking about Teotihuacan, the city
Hmm.
north of Mexico City, that was a historic city, and it's actually so mysterious that they don't even really know who lived there and what happened to them. They know
Yeah,
that other people then.
but it was at its peak. It was probably the biggest city on Earth at that time.
Yeah, and that
Um,
they think that there was a fire, like or a major fire event that destroyed a lot of the buildings. But this is what I mean. Like, how does a society like that was, how many people do they estimate lived there? Was it like
I can't
100,000 or
remember. I
something?
think it
Or
was around 100, 200,000.
so how something like that disappears? Obviously, we know how it can happen over maybe generations even, but how that there is now no understanding of what used to be probably the biggest city on the planet. Like
Mm, mm,
what happened that we don't even know. Would that ever
mm.
happen to something like London? Would in 1,000 years' time or 10,000 years' time, would somebody be sitting down saying, "Well, we know that there was
Well,
all
yeah,
these
exactly.
bridges
Yeah,
across the river, but we don't know who lived there and what they did."
I don't. I think now with the digital storing of information, I think there'll always be. Although this is exactly what people would have said in other
Oh
civilizations. They would
yeah,
have said,
we've
"Well,
written everything down. Yeah,
we've written everything down, or we put it on a stone tablet, so there's no way that future people won't know what's going on." But then,
yeah.
yeah, it does get lost. But yeah, I mean, there will be sea level rise, which probably does engulf all of London in the next, I don't know, what time period, 300, 400 years perhaps. Um, and so, yeah, you do wonder what will remain, or maybe people won't actually care that much about what happened. It reminds me of Futurama, when they say old New York. Is that old New York? Is that what they call it?
Yeah,
Where
old New
it's that
York.
old New York, where it's all sort of underground and they've built up above it. Um, but yeah, like it really does make you sort of think about the impermanence of things that we think are so embedded and permanent in society, can actually just become irrelevant and forgotten. Um,
I suppose since the start of the Earth or the start of life on Earth, this is now going to break our brains a bit. But since the start of organized life forms and on Earth, there's only really been one incident of like instantaneous mass destruction, and that's when the um, thing smashed into Mexico, and what
but
scientists believe killed the dinosaurs. And
yeah, and the way he describes it in that podcast about sort of sending a ripple that, I mean, literally would have gone around the Earth.
yeah,
Um,
so that, like, there was a lot of life on Earth,
mm.
dinosaurs and bird slash dinosaur hybrids and like amoebas and reptiles and all sorts of things. I don't think there were any
Amoebas on fleas on rats.
there weren't any humanoids, were there, or like
No,
at that
no.
time. So,
Well,
but
as
we
far as we
think,
know.
well, as far as we know, but we think of that as kind of like a sort of a wiping out of everything on Earth and restarting. But actually, things survived. I mean,
Yeah.
there were like little mammals, like rodent-sized mammals that are our descendants. Like, we are alive because
No, they're
those
our
creatures.
ancestors. We are
Oh,
their
we.
descendants.
I'm gonna have some rat babies.
We're going to devolve. Well, maybe that's what's happening. Maybe we've reached this sort of crescent, and then maybe we're just going to devolve from here on in like a few hundred years. We'll forget how to like speak.
Yeah.
We'll be little furry
So
rodents.
that this understanding that there was like mushrooms or fungi that survived, there was some animals in that were able to get underground and burrow down far enough that they didn't like scorch alive or die. They
Mm-hmm.
were able to survive for however many millennia it took for the Earth to restabilize. I mean, you didn't have to be underground for 5 years. I mean, these things had to live for,
I think it was
like, how
like
long was it?
thousands of years. Like, mate, I don't know.
Like,
I mean, we're not educated on this, but we'll talk about it
but
anyway.
like, isn't that phenomenal? Like, this is enough to give you an existential crisis, that we are alive because this handful of creatures were able to burrow underground to escape the most cataclysmic event that this planet has ever seen. That's how we're alive. It kind of puts things in perspective a bit of how like insignificant everything we do is as a society. That
and it's still not on a daily basis, because I don't sort of think of it consciously anyway, but it still does blow my mind that from essentially a bucket of mud, life develops. Like, what's that Bill? There's a Bill Bryson book. Is it A Short History of Nearly Everything? I think it's that one, where he talks about that. He talks about how scientists still don't really quite understand how it happened. Like, how you can just have not a bucket, but just for the purpose of this example, that you can just literally have a bucket of inert atoms of different materials, and that give it enough time, life just developed. And now look at us on our recording our podcast on our laptops plugged into electricity. Like, it seems impossible. And if we've come this far, then could we evolve to something even more incredible and beyond our actual imagination at this point?
Isn't that wild, right? You sat there talking about, we're on a podcast, we're on these computers, things called computers. I've got a ring light here, there's electricity. I'm looking out, there are like skyscrapers around me. And then I'm also talking about this rodent like predecessor of mine.
Or not even a rodent, just like a couple of cells. Like,
well, this is what I'm talking about. I'm going back then. Like, I'm going like, so there's this rodent that was my great grandfather, right? But then that rodent, to the concept of that rodent, if you go back time immemorial before that,
the primordial swamp.
Yeah, there's something then that would, the concept of that would seem so far removed from that rodent that survived
even our consciousness is so far removed from the origins of life. I actually don't have words to express my disbelief or my complete dumbfoundedness around it. Like, it just doesn't make sense to me.
And then, talking about like listeners to the pod, regular listeners, Michelle, will know that.
I don't know if Helen, are you still listening? Are you with us, Helen? Because I haven't seen you comment in a while. If you're still listening, Helen, then drop us a line, drop us a comment.
People would have heard me say that quote from Brian Cox a few times about, at the end of the universe, nothing will happen, and it will continue not happening forever. Like, that will be the end. Has the universe never had, or our concept of the universe has never had that? There's always been something. But
and that's why I'm not convinced that Brian Cox is right, because I think, how could we know? How can we know in our like minuscule understanding of the universe? We have effectively we have no understanding of the universe. I think we like to think we do. Maybe it gives us a sense of agency in our lives, in our existence, but we really have no idea.
Are you making a statement? Are you making a statement here now publicly on the pod that your understanding of the operational mechanics of the universe are exactly the same as Professor Brian Cox?
No, I'm just countering his claim that how do we know without fully understanding how life begins? How do we know?
You're not going to start on about flat earthing now, are you? Or we didn't actually go to the moon?
Well, now that you come to mention it, no, of course not. But
oh my god, flat earthing is one of my favorite things. We have spoken about it on the pod, so we won't go on about it. But it is so entertaining.
I think there's not to castigate Brian Cox. I like Brian Cox. He's a good TV presenter or whatever. But I just think there's a certain arrogance that we have as humans. Like, I think it's just built into us. So we have this arrogance that we understand and we know, and we don't. We still cannot explain really how life began and how it's evolved. And I think, what was I reading a few months ago? We have our understanding is that we amoebas started, I don't know, existing, and then they somehow grew into slightly more complex beings, and then that process continued and continued and continued, and then today we have humans, we have
Yeah.
sharks, we have whales, we have all these different forms of life. But there was something I was reading recently. I'll try and if I can find it, if I remember, I'll put it in the show notes. And they were just saying there is practically no fossil evidence that shows how one thing became another. And that's not to
Yeah.
say it didn't exist, but you would think if there were so many iterations and so many evolutions or evolutionary processes that had to happen for us to get what we now call a bottlenose dolphin, for example, or
Yes.
to get a, I don't know, fucking Bengal tiger, whatever. You would think that there would be so many fossil records of previous species, previous evolutions that would have gone from, whatever the common cat ancestor was to all the cats that we have in the world today. But there's just not. And so it just, I think
I
there's
think there
this.
are. I think there
No,
are. I
I
think
don't
there
think there
are.
are.
There are. But you think if you're talking about species that would be so old, like they don't, their fossils wouldn't exist anymore. They would be crushed by time and pressure and
I think,
millennia.
yeah.
Like how could something that was 5 million years old, like that was as fragile as
But
something
but we find dinosaur bones. That's what I'm saying. Like dinosaurs had evolved. Excuse me. Dinosaurs had evolved before a lot of the creatures that we now see on Earth had
yeah.
evolved, and yet we can find lots of dinosaur fossils. So I don't know. Maybe what I think. I think this is actually a good research project for Michelle. If you're still with us, Michelle, this is exactly the sort of thing Michelle can counter my outrageous claims with some science based evidence. But I don't know. I think humans have an arrogance in our understanding of the universe where we actually have absolutely no concept of how anything really works and how life began and how it evolved and how it will
Yeah.
continue to evolve or not evolve. So
Yeah.
yeah,
I
that's
suppose
my.
like the magic formula that needs to happen for fossilization is incredibly rare. Do you know what I mean? So like there has to be like a body or a specimen has to be buried like almost instantly, right, to preserve enough of the thing for it to not decompose. And then it has to be buried by a certain type of materials. It has to be
Mhm.
buried
It has to
at a
be
certain,
anaerobic or whatever,
what's anaerobic?
like with no oxygen present. Like
Yeah.
it has to
And
be
then and
sealed
then
off.
and then it has to be buried to a certain depth, and then if it goes below that depth it can be like pressurized into disintegrating, like, and then you think over tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions of years, the chances of that happening the right way to a certain number of things is so rare. And that's why when they often find fossils in one area, they find lots of fossils, because the magic formula for fossilization happened there, and it happened once. And so you'll find like a sea
Right.
of dinosaurs, or and then, but then there were trillions of other creatures that lived at the same time as that particular batch of dinosaurs that weren't fossilized because there wasn't the magic formula. And
Mm.
so I think that's why it's so rare. And I suppose there's this sort of lack of understanding of how fossilization works is
Mm.
probably what helps fire creationists in thinking that, oh, what we know must be the only thing that ever existed, because
Or alien conspiracies that think that
yeah.
humans must have been aliens. And I mean we don't know. I mean, who knows
Oh my
what
God, don't go
fucking
down
where
that
we came
route.
from? No, I'm just saying, like, we think we understand that we developed from Neanderthal um, humanoids, um, but yeah, again, we don't have 100% concrete evidence for any of this. I don't think
No, but we
that's
also,
my point.
what we do have is science and common sense. So
Yeah, and arrogance. I think that I'm just saying, like, I think there's a lot that we think we understand that we don't fully understand, that we claim to.
and for
Um,
anyone worried, we are not verging into a conspiracy podcast. Just to
no,
put that
no,
word out there.
no. Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. But I kind of chuckle a little bit when people come out with very broad, sweeping statements uh, that would imply that they know everything, and it's like, well, no, actually, we
You
don't.
sound
You know.
you sound very conspiracy theorist at the moment by describing yourself as someone sat behind their laptop in in the bedroom at their mum's house, chuckling to themselves at people's scientific takes on the universe.
Yeah, actually, that does sound very conspiracy esque, conspiracy adjacent.
Uh-huh.
I'm just asking questions, Sean.
Yeah, why don't you do your own research? Anyway,
Yeah.
while you were talking there for a while, I did Google about the etymology of the Alice band, and
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
the most common consensus is that it was because Alice in Wonderland was depicted as wearing
Oh,
one.
of course. Yeah, that's
And
obvious,
I
right?
don't know if
Yeah.
that's true, but it sounds obvious, right?
Yeah.
Maybe we
Yeah.
could ask Professor Brian Cox the
Mm.
legitimacy of that claim, if he has any
The
imperial
the
evidence.
evolution of the Alice band. What are the
Um,
previous incarnations of the Alice? What was
but
it called before Alice in Wonderland?
what's great about that podcast as well is the explanation of how humans got to the Americas across
Mm.
the landmass, the across through Asia, and where I suppose it's the Bering Strait now,
Mm.
and over there, and horses and other animals, like there were mammoths, I didn't know this, that there are mammoth fossils in the Valley of Mexico. And
Mm.
so all of these creatures, humans and otherwise, came across, but then when the Ice Age ended and it was cut off again, it's weird to think that exchange of life between humans and animals that was it. Apart from
Mm.
animals that could fly, that
Mm.
was it then for tens of thousands of years.
Yeah,
That
no, it's
there was
mind
no
blowing.
then connection, and then so civilizations developed in isolation of each other
Mm.
after having the possibility of interchanging ideas and DNA and everything, and then they developed separately. And that what I didn't realize is that I knew that there were no native horses to the Americas, but
Mm.
there used to be. They
Yeah,
believed that there were
horses.
horses.
Well, they think horses, or what the ancestors of horses that what we recognize today as horses, were originally from the Americas. But then,
No, 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 no. Well, that podcast said that they were originally from the other landmass, and they came across with humans and mammoths, and then they were hunted out to extinction by the humans that were then cut off when the Ice Age ended.
oh, I thought he said in that podcast they'd originated in the Americas. Then they'd gone into what we now know as Asia or Eurasia, when the sea levels are a lot lower,
Oh, I
and
thought it was the
then
other way around. Let's have a
and
quick
then
look.
they died off, or been hunted or died off in the Americas, and then didn't reappear in the Americas until the Spanish brought them in the 1500s. That's what I thought he was
Um,
saying.
yeah, no. I think it was the other way around. Horses evolved over millions of years from small multi-toed creatures to large single-toed animals we know today. I mean, domestication began around 4000 BCE in Central Asia. But let me have a look.
Because in later in the episode, he talks about when the Spanish came with their horses on their ships. The indigenous Mexican tribes called them deer because they had no frame of reference for horses, because
Yeah,
horses had been extinct in the Americas at that point for thousands of years. That's what I thought he was saying.
and Hill was telling me, because I was talking to Hill about this, and Hill
Hmm.
was saying they were taught at school in Mexico in history class that the people who were living there when the conquistadors and the Europeans arrived with horses couldn't understand that the horse and the human on the horse were two different creatures, that
Hmm.
they
Okay.
thought it was like some sort of monster.
Yeah.
And Um,
When I listened to that podcast, it did make me think. Sorry, I know I'm going very conspiracy adjacent on this episode, but it did make me think about how it would have. It's like if today, if alien spaceship came and landed,
yeah,
like it would these Spanish conquistadors would have looked so different to the people living in what we now call Mexico, and their technology was so different, and it would have been as if if a spaceship like a flying saucer landed in
yeah.
Trafalgar Square and like little green men got out or something. It would be that extreme and that shocking and that. I mean, again, this is my understanding, and maybe it wasn't, but that's how I'd imagine it to be today.
Okay, so a little bit of fact checking on the pod.
Okay.
Horses did not start in either Asia or the Americas as a whole. The ancestors of modern horses originated only in a small part of North America, like what is now North America.
Right.
They started up there, and from there they migrated over to Eurasia, over the Bering Land Bridge, and then they, went down further, but they became extinct in North America around 10,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Um,
That's what I was saying. That's what he was saying on
so,
the podcast.
but so they weren't native to what is even now because there were horses all through the Americas, right? Like,
Well, I don't know if there were or not, but yeah, my understanding was that they had originated in the Americas and had. Anyway, yeah, yeah.
but like it's like this sort of thing, right? What you were saying, nobody can go back in time and know for sure, and we
No,
can't even know for sure that these creatures that we're talking about that cross the Bering Strait are any relation to horses that we know now. But the common understanding is that they are, that
yeah,
they're the
but the
ancestors.
fossil records don't exist to prove
But
it beyond,
well, maybe they do. I don't know. Maybe
or
maybe
all
we
right, yeah,
just,
maybe they exist, but maybe we haven't found them,
or
But
maybe people have found them and we just don't know about the information.
maybe. And there were periods as well, just going back to the whole evolution thing. I think there were periods in history where um, mutation was a lot more common, and I don't think scientists understand why. But without those periods, we wouldn't have such a varied, um, variety of species. Varied variety. That's not the right term I want to use, but you know what I mean. Like we wouldn't have such a variety of species that we do today without periods in history where mutation was a lot more common, and that because we don't see, certainly not in modern human history, we don't see evolution of species that you might expect to see. I mean, I know evolution takes a long, long, long time, but I think maybe to do with higher levels of radiation in the Earth's atmosphere at different periods of
Yeah.
history, that they did see a lot more mutation, and therefore that led to more sort of evolutionary diversity or whatever. But
I
yeah,
mean, what evolution is still happening to humans? I
well, that's
mean,
it. I don't know. I don't know that there is any documented
I
evolution.
mean,
But anyway, we should wrap up soon because we could just this will turn into a 4 hour episode like Fall of Civilizations.
I wonder what changes are happening to us. I mean, I know that evolution is happening at a slower pace for humans, and I think that has a lot to do with medicine. It is stopping our bodies from having to adapt to things. So, like modern
But
medicine is,
just humans though, or is it all species? Like I thought, I don't know.
I don't know. Yeah, maybe this is another
Maybe we'll have to
podcast.
address this in another episode. But
But yeah,
yeah,
you think if you take out the reasons or a lot of the reasons why a species would have to adapt, like if you
mm,
introduce medicine or scientific or medical interventions, that
mm.
that species doesn't have to adapt as much to hardship, and so it
Yeah, but
slows
I don't.
down.
Yeah, again though, I don't know. Neither of us are biologists. I don't know if that's how biological beings change. I don't think it's like some innate thing built into our cells or our biology which says, oh, this kind of food is scarce, so I'm going to work out a way of being able to process calories from this kind of food instead. I don't
Yeah, but
know that.
like if we were all suddenly eating high carbohydrate foods,
You say
and we would
suddenly,
get,
yeah, that's my day-to-day life anyway.
yeah, but that's what I mean. Like if this happened, so we're in this situation, but we didn't have all of the medical and medicinal interventions to help counteract the effects of that, our bodies would have to change to adapt. Like, you can go to some parts of the world where people can eat mostly only fish. But if you
Mm.
gave somebody in London a 99% fish diet, they might get sick after a certain amount of time. So there must be ways that what you consume and the medical interventions and the medicinal interventions that you have help change the way that your
Let's
body
ask
reacts.
let's ask Brian Cox.
Professor Brian Cox.
Yeah, we'll ask him.
Okay.
All right. Well, let's leave it there for today. We'll be
Right.
back with more evolutionary theories next week.
Okay. Right. Well,
Um,
where can people find you online if they want to find out more
if they want
about?
to argue with me about my ideology, then yeah, you can find me at Josh and the Jumpstarts on Instagram, Spotify, YouTube. I don't know, wherever. TikTok.
If people want to find out about me, they can go to fatgayvegan.com. Follow me on Instagram. Come along to events that we run, like the Queer Open Mic. I also run a London Vegan Social. If you want to come hang out, you don't have to be vegan, but you do have to be social.
Mhm. Likewise, you don't have to be queer to come to the Queer Open Mic. I mean, you have to be queer to perform, but you're welcome to come and watch, even if you're not queer. All right, we will be back in your feeds on YouTube, Spotify, and now Apple Podcasts this time next week. Until then, you can find us, Tell Me Where I'm Going Wrong, on social media channels as well. But yeah, thanks for joining us on this. Go ahead.
And if in the meantime, if for some reason a cataclysmic event occurs, just make sure you're in the exact right spot to get the right amount of soil dumped on top of you to preserve you for millennia.
Yeah, and let's hope if any trace of humanity survives, let's hope it's this podcast, so future generations can be like, what a fucking bunch of fools. What were they talking about? They had no idea.
Right.
All right, folks. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.